What's up, everybody? It's Ty the Bourbon Guy, and welcome back to another whiskey review. Today we are reviewing Fort Hamilton Rye Whiskey. Fort Hamilton actually prides themselves on focusing primarily on rye whiskey. It has been a focus of theirs since being started, and for those that may not be as familiar, they're based out of Brooklyn, New York, and they focus on rye whiskey 100% until it seems like recently, where now I've seen they actually have a double barrel bourbon, I believe, and a single barrel bourbon as well. So they're kind of dipping their toes in the bourbon world, but their focus primarily when they were starting was rye whiskey. And a lot of that has to do with the history of the country and with the history of American whiskey in general, with rye being distilled before bourbon was. That's the story, and you can read more about it on their website. Disclaimer, I've actually received a few different bottles from Fort Hamilton themselves. This particular one is not one of them. Working with craft distilleries, it's important to me to work with them and to try their whiskey if I can, and be able to provide a review or explain my experience with that whiskey. And sometimes distribution is not always there, or whatever the case may be. And this particular one, because it was a store pick from my local liquor store, it was one that I didn't really have that many expectations going into it. And I tried it in the store, and I thought, I need a bottle of it. So this particular single barrel is 122 proof. And, I tried it. I felt the heat on it, but it wasn't too overpowering from what I can remember. The color impressed me, and part of that has to do with the barrel sizes that they're using. But it was just something that, with no expectation going into it, it really impressed me. And it impressed me so much so that I actually reached out to Fort Hamilton, hoping to work together on something, or try more of their products, or maybe do a podcast or a YouTube live or something. But a lot of the distilleries that I work with, I actually am the one that reaches out to them originally. From there, we kind of figure out different things. But even if somebody were to send me a bottle, I still maintain creative control. I'm allowed to say whatever I want to say about that whiskey. But Fort Hamilton in general has been a great company so far, in a sense of trying different whiskeys and just getting to know them as a company. So I will say that right off the bat, just to be transparent. Again, this particular one is a rye whiskey, and for me, rye was not a category that I was always comfortable getting into. Bourbon was my jam. And so to go from there and to try to figure out, how do I approach rye, and to understand that I'm dealing with a rye whiskey and not a bourbon, and try to separate the two and understand the experience is going to be different. And I think there were certain rye whiskeys that have kind of helped me get there. But now I do enjoy ryes. Last year, when I looked at my top whiskeys of the year, I realized that most of my top whiskeys were rye whiskey. So I think it's kind of twofold. I think, one, my palate has developed more and more over the years, and has allowed me now to appreciate and kind of acclimate more to rye whiskey flavors. I also think that there are more and more of a variety when it comes to rye whiskey. I think more distilleries are interested in it. You have companies like Fort Hamilton that are interested in making rye the primary whiskey in their lineups. There's a lot of creativity now going on with rye, and just there's so much now that I think I'm starting to see in the rye whiskey game that I didn't originally see when I first got into bourbon. With all that being said, all that's great. But again, let's talk about the whiskey. So the bottle itself is, I'm a fan of this bottle shape, and I don't know, I just am a fan of this. I feel like the label stands out on a shelf. Again, not necessarily trying to sell to me. I'm always a fan of that. The Fort Hamilton, just with the history, it's based out of New York, out of Brooklyn. So, just the history there, when it comes to, Hamilton and all the history in New York with the different battles. I think that's just kind of speaking to the history. I don't know that they're trying to sell to me in any particular way. One of the things that I would love to see is on the side here, there's actually an age statement of 5 years. And I think that should be highlighted maybe a little bit more. I would love to maybe see that maybe in the middle here, in the front, some type of way. But I think that's important. I mean, you have a 5-year whiskey, especially for a brand that in my area, a lot of people are not as familiar with. I think that's something to highlight for sure. The other piece here that interests me on all of the Fort Hamilton bottles it seems to be that they list that they're distilled in New York, but then bottled by. So for me as a consumer, I'm just always interested in more transparency. I would love to know, yes, distilled in New York, but bottled by Fort Hamilton. What, that could be them or it could not be. And so just that transparency, I think, would be great as a consumer. I think we're in a place that right now where the whiskey world loves to know more about the whiskey, and there sometimes are different pieces in play to where they can't explain where they got it from. But and I understand that 100%, but I think as a consumer, it's just something that's more and more important to understand where that whiskey's coming from. I don't think a lot of consumers really care that you source. If that's the case, I do not know that if that's the case here, but we just want there to be transparency and figure out where that's coming from. So that would be probably the only critique I have of this. But again, you see the sticker here that it's a single barrel. It was picked by a local liquor store that I absolutely love their picks. I tried this and I absolutely had to have it. It's all great what the bottle looks like. Again, let's see what's inside the bottle. So at 122 proof, I mean, you can pick up the ethanol for sure. I think that's just going to be the case. I think as I kind of keep going back to it, the oak is heavy, an oak presence. So there is a dark feel to it when it comes to the oak and the, it's not really even chocolate, but just that dark leathery, we're going in that direction. But on top of that, there's a citrus element. So the complexity to me is there. In a weird way, it reminds me of, like, when I say reminds me, as if I've ever smelled this in my entire life. But it makes me think of if you had the charred oak, which makes sense for American whiskey. If you had the charred oak, but you had some type of fruit, and I can't really pinpoint the fruit. At first I thought maybe citrus, but I think now I could see maybe a stone fruit, maybe a peach, that type of thing. But as if the juice from that fruit was sprinkled over top of, like if you had like a wood stave, like a charred oak stave, and you were to squeeze citrus something or some type of fruit over top of it, and the oils and the juice that lands on that wood, that's to me what this comes out as. And I know a lot of people probably will think, what in the world are you talking about? But I don't know. But that's kind of, I get a citrus element, and I also get that oak leather going in that direction as well. So a lot of people, and myself included, sometimes kind of think, forget all the notes. Do you like the whiskey or not? I do think it's important to identify, maybe not go into too much detail when it comes to tasting notes or what I'm smelling or what's on the palate, what's on the nose. But sometimes it's important because if you know that, and I absolutely love whiskeys that have a chocolate note to them. If I am reviewing something or if I'm talking about a whiskey and it's got that chocolate note, now you know that you might be interested in that and your palate may align. So I try to give notes so that it kind of makes sense, but at the same time, we don't need to go crazy. Let's just try the whiskey, see if we like it. Cheers. So it being 122 proof, it's hot. It drinks 122 for sure. But I would say that we're going, again, kind of with the darker notes on the palate. The oak comes through. The leather is there. I don't really get any chocolate. I don't really get any coffee. I don't feel like we're going in that direction. I think we're going more in the leather side. On the initial sip, the citrus is gone. What I smelled in the nose there is no longer lingering. This is all heavy. This is leather. I wonder how many times I can say leather. But that's the direction I feel like we're going. Black pepper, so it's got that spice, and that might be part of the proof, it being 122 proof. But black pepper and leather are my main, and oak are my main notes I'm getting on the palate. But that's an initial sip on 122 proof whiskey. Let's go back again and see if anything changes. So as is the case with most high proof whiskeys, with this being 122 proof, when I first took a sip, it hits you in the mouth. The pepper is there, it's hot, it's spicy. The oak, that's all I can really taste, and it's hard to kind of get through that layer. But for me, after I have the initial sip, when I return to the nose, when I return to the palate and do all those other things, I start to kind of get past that burn, and now my palate is acclimated to that, and I can now pick up the flavors. So even when you're sipping high proof whiskey, just kind of keep that in mind that yes, it's hot initially. Even somebody that's enjoyed whiskey for a long time, it's still hot. It doesn't matter. It's always going to be kind of, in that initial tasting. But when you go back, that's where you kind of pick out more flavor. So as I go back, vanilla now sneaks in here, and I didn't get vanilla initially at all anywhere, and I'm starting to now get that almost like a butterscotch maybe, which I feel like for me is kind of unique in rye. To me, this is a rye that does not have any of the pine needles, the wintergreen, any of those notes. This is going in a whole different direction. The only thing that maybe hints to me that this is either high rye or a rye whiskey is that black pepper on the initial palate. Everything else is kind of leaning towards more of like a bourbon to me, to where this isn't going to overpower. I'm a person that even now that I drink rye whiskey, I don't particularly care for those notes of the pine needles and you know, the wintergreen, all that stuff. Any of the green notes coming from rye, I don't care for it. But this is a rye whiskey that I'm not 100% sure if it was in a blind and I were to try it, maybe along other bourbons, I might just think it's a high rye, but I don't know that I would ever pick out that this is actually a rye whiskey. We're along the same lines, but we're not going too far off the track that this is definitely a bourbon or whatever the case is. It still lets you know that it's a rye, but it's not smack you in the face, hey, I'm a rye whiskey. Now remember, this is actually a single barrel and this was picked. So the chances of, you know, you having the same exact experience, that's going to differ just because of that factor. So I have not tried their other single barrel ryes, but this pick I think is a great pick. I think this is a fantastic idea to get Fort Hamilton on the map. It did for me, and I'm hoping that they continue to do this with other liquor stores or clubs or whatever it may be across the country. I tried this pick, and that's what opened my eyes to what Fort Hamilton can be and what they are. And I think at that point, it made me more interested in their brand. It made me more interested in their other products. So I would highly encourage them to continue that. I mean, however many single barrels you can, you know, put out, I think would be fantastic. And I'm curious, I would love to try their regular single barrel offering to see how that compares to a store pick. But, you know, it kind of reminds me in a way of what New Riff did, where they had these picks, even though a lot of people, I mean, you kind of knew the bottle to bond, but when you started now trying their single barrels, it seemed like there was a time period where everybody had their single barrels and everybody was picking a New Riff pick, but it kind of put them on the map of what is possible within New Riff. That's kind of what I feel like this could do for Fort Hamilton. Again, I myself didn't really know too much about them. I taste it in a store, love it so much that I buy the bottle and reach out to them wanting to possibly do something together. That kind of tells you already what my thoughts are on this whiskey, but I still have to give it an overall score. So with all that stuff being said, I think I'm going to rate this whiskey a 91. I think it is a great value. I think it is one of those whiskeys that I had no expectations going into it, and when I tried it, it surpassed the expectations that I had. You know, sometimes I think we look at craft distilleries or smaller distilleries and we think that maybe it's not as good, and I think that logic has to go out the window. Maybe that might have been true 3, 4, 5 years ago. I think that's starting to not be the case. If you have whiskey that from a craft distillery or whatever it may be that, you know, when you first tried it, it was 2 years old. If that was 4 years ago, I mean, you could be sitting at a 5-year, 6-year product. This being 5 years age dated, I think that tells us everything we need to know. This whiskey is old enough to hold up. Rye whiskey, in my opinion, doesn't necessarily need to age as long as bourbon to really become really good. So with all those things being said, I think this is a really good pour. I think that I'd love to see this in a cocktail. 122 proof is definitely going to stand up. I think rye in general stands up. It's got the black pepper. So all those things being said, I think you can use this in a cocktail. I think you can drink it neat and enjoy it. I think if you're somebody that's new into whiskey, 122 proof and a rye with all the pepper notes might be a little aggressive and might make it unapproachable in that sense. So if you're new to whiskey and you still want to try this particular, you know, their rye single barrel, won't be this single barrel, obviously. But if you want to try one of their higher proof products, I would recommend maybe trying it with water, trying with ice, you know, that sort of thing first, or maybe just making an old fashioned or making a cocktail of some sort and trying it that way. That's what I would recommend. I don't know that a beginner would really appreciate it, and especially if somebody's getting into bourbon, they may not be ready to try rye whiskey. But I think if you are looking for a rye whiskey that's similar to a bourbon and kind of gives you a similar experience, I think this would be one that you might need to put on your list. Great job, Fort Hamilton. I'm really looking forward to seeing all the other items that you have coming out, and different products coming out. Their single barrel bourbon I will be reviewing here soon. I'm excited to try that for sure. So fantastic job on the rye. Amazing job in picking it, West Clay Wine and Spirits. Thank you so much for tuning in. And as I always say, you're here this long, subscribe, like, do all the things, and I'll catch you in the next review. Cheers.